Welcome, welcome, welcome to PFX102. And this one's going to be about yoga and meditation and how they relate to our journey of cultivating our psychic abilities. And it's a really special one because I have invited Julian XEER to be a guest speaker. And we're going to have the amazing NANDANI also helping us throughout the class, and because they're both really amazing practitioners of few different things. I would say all of us have in common that we practice some form of alchemy and art, and all have a good amount of experience in yoga and meditation. And we're going to be doing, after this lecture, a group discussion. So we're going to get a chance to connect with each other and unmute you. And so Julian is a yoga teacher and meditation instructor, and also a writer, software developer, Afrofuturist thinker, and all kinds of things. We've been never actually met in real life, but we've been having some really interesting conversations. So I'm excited to have. We're going to start by letting Julian speak first on a few things, most of which are going to be coming from a book that is available on the website. If you go to that link that I added in the chat, you can download it for free. And you don't have to have read it or anything, but if you want to go into that and learn more about any of the things we're talking about here, you're more than welcome to. So, hi, Julian.
Hi, so I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be contributing. So I guess the first thing that I want to talk about is just to start to define some terms. Since the word yoga, we hear it all the time and we all have our own associations about what yoga means. I think that a lot of us think about yoga in terms of physical postures, like asana practice. And that's definitely an important part of yoga, but it is not yoga as a whole. So I think that the best source that we can go to get a clear understanding about what is yoga, what is its purposes, what is it all about, and how do we go about practicing it, is an ancient text by the name of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And Patanjali was a sage that basically compiled a system of what's called Raja Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga. Ashtanga means 8-limbed. So it's a system of yoga that contains 8 limbs that works towards the fulfillment of the purpose of yoga. Now, in the first sutra, there's a line. In Sanskrit, it reads as Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means yoga is the cessation of the restlessness of the mind. So yoga, that's a very simple definition, but I think it gets to the very heart of what yoga is all about. Yoga is about completely relaxing yourself inside, right? And why, right? So essentially, we have this body that has a mind, and then underlying that mind is this substrata of consciousness, which traditionally we call the soul, right? In yoga, it's known as the Atman, right? And this soul is the self. And our experience of reality is mired by the activity of the mind that blocks us from seeing who we truly are. And it is out of that confusion that all of our suffering emanates, whether it's our personal suffering within our own minds and hearts, or the interpersonal conflicts that we experience out in the world. All of these things are rooted in a single source. So yoga and yoga philosophy sees human suffering as having a single source, and its solution also being singular in nature. And so we live in what they call Maya, illusion, or samsara. Samsara being like the psychological maze produced by this false self-concept that keeps us trapped and keeps us suffering. And the means whereby this maze can be worked through is actually just by quieting the waves of thought that obstruct our awareness of the soul. And we do that through the practice of yoga. Now, yoga, as is defined by Patanjali, has 8 limbs, right? The first limb is called yama, which are things that you don't do. Niyama, the things that you do. Asana, which is the physical postures. Pratyahara, which is interior focus. And those first 4 limbs comprise of what are known as the external yogas. And then the internal yogas are dharana, which is concentration practice, dhyana, which is meditation, and samadhi, which is self-realization, the state of absorption in your true self. That is yoga. Yoga essentially is samadhi. Samadhi is synonymous with enlightenment. So yoga is enlightenment. Now, when I sort of came to the practice of yoga, my first introduction was through a system known as like Zen Buddhism, or Mahayana Buddhism. And in that, I came about this when I was about 15, and we had to take certain vows known as like the Bodhisattva Vows, right? And the Bodhisattva vow is basically this vow or this intention that you set out to make, where you will attain spiritual liberation, you will attain enlightenment as soon as you possibly can, so that you can be of benefit to others, so that you can be of benefit for the collective enlightenment of the planet. And so the goal, that wish, the energy of that wish is something called bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the will or the energy or the intention to wake up as soon as possible so that you can be of benefit to the collective awakening of the world. We're living at a time right now where we're seeing this mass kind of like spiritual revival, this occult revival, this mystical revival. And for me, I frame that entirely within the context of a process of planetary enlightenment that we're all collectively engaged in. And I think that it's really important to be clear and have a right attitude about the goal of yoga. And it's important to have a right attitude about how that relates to the problem of suffering in ourselves and within the world. And so it's often thought that like enlightenment or yoga or samadhi is this very inaccessible thing. It's this thing that's only achievable by a select few. And that's really not the case, right? It's everybody's birthright to experience the ground of their own being. And through the practice of yoga and the attainment of samadhi, all you're really doing is experiencing the truth about who you are. And this truth is ever present. Your consciousness is ever present. And you're not really achieving anything. You're just removing the obstacles to being aware of what is always already there. And in fact, it is what is aware of your entire experience. It's what is aware of your body. It's aware of your mind and all of its contents. It's what's aware of the world. And it's at that level that we're all essentially, we all essentially have the same singular consciousness. And it's that realization that comes about through the practice of yoga. I think that that's also of particular importance as a group of people with marginalized identities that are practicing and thinking through what are the intersections between marginalization, liberation, and magic and spirituality. And I think that the path and practice of yoga gives us a very clear understanding of what is at the root of all of our suffering, and how do we go about achieving liberation from suffering such that liberation from oppression is inseparable from total spiritual liberation. And so I think about the planetary enlightenment and the enlightenment of the liberation of people on the margins as essentially the enlightenment of the people on the margins. And so our collective enlightenment is part of the enlightenment of the planet itself. And so that process of yoga, it's not something that happens overnight, but rather a gradual evolutionary process where we evolve through first having gross awareness. What they call gross awareness is awareness of the physical body and the physical world, to subtle awareness or awareness of our life force energy, our chi, our energy meridians and systems. But then with this also comes awareness of the astral world and the astral plane. And then from there, causal awareness, which the causal relates to the sort of deep psyche, the deep mind, the deep level of ourselves that is actually the blueprint for our external experience. And then finally to the non-dual awareness, the awareness that transcends this limitation of self and other, this boundary. And so this awareness from gross to subtle to causal to non-dual is the path of awareness with yoga. It's a path of progressively growing more and more subtle in our interior awareness, more and more subtle in our inner space until we land at the ground of our own being. And so it's within that context of seeing the path from gross, subtle, causal to non-dual awareness that then we can talk about the relationship between yoga and magic, right? Because when we talk about magic, when we talk about having psychic visions and psychic abilities, these subtle senses like clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, etc., all of that takes place between the space of the gross and non-dual awareness. That's as awareness becomes more and more subtle and you become aware of energy, you become aware of these subtler planes of reality. This happens naturally by virtue of just practicing yoga. It doesn't necessarily have to be a goal in and of itself, but just by engaging in these practices every day and your awareness becomes more subtle, then these senses start to come online. But it's important to have right attitude in terms of the goal and purpose of practice, because that right attitude will simultaneously lead to the natural cultivation of these senses, but then also it will give us the right attitude about how to use them in service of our own liberation and the liberation of others, and not for other egotistical purposes, which is very easy to fall into.
But anyways.
Yeah, and thank you, Kali, for slaying this demon that just came into our group.
Yeah, the
It
demon
happens.
is actually in waiting. I can now see everyone that wants to come in, and I can see the list of people who want to come back in to do that. So it's interesting. They're in my little dungeon right now.
But they have, you can see their names and you can recognize them.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important what you were saying about collective enlightenment and how the spiritual is really and yoga as a tool for that is extremely applicable and necessary for marginalized people, because first of all, it was created by people who are now extremely marginalized, or at least transmitted, recorded as a science first. And second of all, it's like, it's weird because I feel like a lot of people of color don't really feel they have the time for something like yoga or meditation. I mean, a lot of people now, it's such a whole industrial complex, and it's easy enough to just kind of go to a class once a week and engage with it on a physical level. But, you know, upon learning what yoga really means, there's so much more to it. And it's so much about a lifestyle and an attitude and something that pervades every part of your life rather than, you know, being a once a week activity. A lot of people think they don't, especially meditation as part of that. Like, people think they don't have time for it, especially if you're not living a cushy lifestyle. You know, you're like, why would I just sit and do this really gentle exercise? It's not even going to help me lose weight, you know, etc. for however many, you know, minutes a day, however many times a week. But there, you know, if you kind of go into the texts, you can really see how it's so much more necessary for maybe even the people who think the least that they need it, because there's so much in it that's actually very politically useful, socially applicable.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that, and I think that like as like colonized people, also these various narratives that we associate, these narratives that we internalize around ourselves, whether it's as people of color, as non-men, as people that are queer. These narratives are all revolve around like designations of the body, of the gross body, right? And so when we engage in practices such as yoga asana, very quickly what begins to happen is you start to engage very directly with your emotional relationship to the body. And I think that like, you know, there are various stages of self-realization that we have, like realization of the physical self, realization of the mind through swadhyaya or self-study, which is one of the yamas and niyamas. And then finally realization of consciousness. And so it's a very complete system of knowing yourself and mastery over yourself that I think can generate a lot of power and wisdom for us moving forward, and gives us a way of understanding one another that can help to dissolve the conflicts between us so that we can come to a place of true and authentic solidarity and what, you know, King called like beloved community, or like a community that's based on these principles of solidarity and nonviolence with one another. And so I think that there's like a lot of very meaningful social application to this too, because ultimately it's like yoga is for self-realization, but along the path, what one grows to discover is that yoga is a system of wise self-governance. And it enables one to learn how to govern oneself and one's life in increasingly wise ways, which effectively teaches us how to rule collectively, right? And it's sort of like we're in a stage right now where the world is ruled by these very unjust powers. And like in a longer sense, like what does it mean for us to actually seize power and overthrow that? We have to learn how to rule, and we learn how to rule by learning how to rule ourselves or govern ourselves. So I think that that's one place where dharma and social change intersect in yoga, dharma, and social change intersect in very meaningful ways.
Yeah, I love that. And also, by the way, if anyone here doesn't know, Julian and Nandani teach another course together on Triple Goddess, called Nonviolent Communication or Healing Communication, which is based on a book called Nonviolent Communication, right? And I think you were saying that the book has a lot of actually like social justice intent to it. And it kind of doesn't actually have anything explicitly to do with spirituality, but I love that the two of you have been really having that like spirit of of solidarity and like just intersecting all these things, because I think a lot of political activists even don't really find the time in their days to kind of meditate or do yoga or like do this kind of stuff, but it's at its core, it has so much to offer towards those goals. And yeah, but it does take a lot of, there's so many other things though, that's one application, but yoga and meditation, for me, like personally, I came to it through being an artist and studying art and trying to access more of my creativity, because I was feeling so blocked for so long of a time. And I actually, I now base a lot of my practice in a few different schools, and a lot of it does originate from Vedas. And I've linked the Bhagavad-Gita on the site there. And that's a translation that I'm still reading myself. I haven't been all through it, but they do talk about yogas. And there's like Krishna revealing to Arjuna like what the importance of these things really is. And it's while Arjuna is like about to have this bloody battle with people that like he really doesn't want to have to like be violent with, and he's all conflicted. And there's so much solace in, so you could either be a warrior, you could be somebody who's advocating for peace or like social justice or healing, or you could also be an artist. And I think one thing that really got me into, because I was such an atheist at the time in my life too, and David Lynch actually was the person who kind of like got me to take meditation seriously, because I was a big fan of his work. And then I found out that he wrote this book called Catching the Big Fish, and that's also linked on that site if you want to check it out. It's a really short read. He's not like a very wordy person, and in really simple terms. It's of course dedicated to his Swami, who's a yogi. He references Upanishads, which is considered one of the Vedas. But he's a proponent of transcendental meditation, which is this particular type. It's an institution. They charge money and they give you a mantra, and they, sort of put you on in their course of meditation. But what I really took away from it is that like you can just start with 20 minutes a day, hopefully twice a day. And if you really stick to that, there's just so many things that can happen for you that just naturally come out of it. It is like absolutely not a waste of time, because the way that he describes it is like, your mind is like a container, and meditation is just a way to expand that container because then there's just an infinity of ideas that are in there and images that can come to you, and just like traces of things that if you pull on that string, you know, there's so much that unravels, and so many ideas and guidances, and just there's a whole world in there that most of us are generally encouraged to distract ourselves from in everyday life. And once you open that up, there's just so much in there, like, that can push you really, it just opens up so much potential and possibility. I also wanted to talk about how in the like scriptures about yoga, there's a lot from the Vedas that actually outlines the arts as a part of yoga. So, you know, one of them is like classical dance, classical music. And I was able to study Indian classical music for like 4 years proper. And I still practice, but, you know, when I first started learning, my guru told me that singing ragas is a form of yoga. It's nada yoga. Nada means sound. And that kind of blew my mind, you know, because I was always a singer, but and I always knew I felt really good when I was singing, but I had never really approached it as a type of yoga before, a meditation or an exercise or something that could really bring me closer to myself. But it's really amazing how people so far back in time just like absolutely saw the beauty that could ensue of you know, people really taking responsibility for their own self-actualization and for their, you know, owning their creative output, owning their actions, and just being fully aware. And that's, I think, really what is at the core of meditation, because there's so many different forms and so many different types that you can do and ways that people teach it, but it's something that's actually very formless and boundless, and there's so many ways that you can do it, and so many ways that the benefits manifest themselves. So yeah, I just think like one thing that the video on that site in the syllabus or in the course page for today says, it's from Krishnamurti, and he's one of my favorite thinkers, speakers of all time. He really is famous for having torn down so many different systems and formalities, and he was just kind of like, you could view him as a hater, but what he really was doing was deconstructing so many of these, you know, ideas that we have around stuff that like don't actually need to be there, because at its core, like in its purest form, meditation and yoga really don't have, like, they don't look like anything. It's really an internal attitude and an awareness that can just be done in any way possible. You know, like you can be meditating while you're doing the dishes. You can be meditating while you're sitting in full lotus, or you can be meditating while you are talking to your loved ones, like while you're in a fight even, you know? So it's a really amazing talk and video, and I really highly recommend it, especially if you're not somebody who is into like reading all these books that we're recommending here. But yeah, I was just talking to Julian earlier about the life of Krishnamurti, and in this video also he talks a lot about how a lot of yogas take many forms, but the Raja Yoga, or the king of yogas, is really just living a moral life. And you know, there's so many ways that morals and ethics are shaped by culture and time and the you know, our surroundings, but it's really worth noting that, you know, if that's something that you can try to meditate upon or consider, or just sort of refine your idea of that over time, everything else really just comes as a byproduct. And that's what I've definitely experienced personally also, as somebody who's you know, realized they had some psychic ability and decided to try to hone in on them and try to grow them, because it's something that really can't be forced or pursued. any information that you're going to receive on an astral plane, it's going to come to you effortlessly. It has to be done just from the sheer magnetism of the energy that you're accumulating by being aware. And it's always kind of this pulling in of things rather than a moving, outward and pursuing anything. So yeah, I think Julian can do it better than me to talk about Krishnamurti and like how special this person is and why
Yeah.
I love him.
Yeah, I think that as far as like the scope of like this course in this specific class, there's like a lot of really special things a lot of really special lessons that I think the life of Krishnamurti illustrates. So for those of you that don't know, Krishnamurti, his spiritual life really began at around the age of 10, where C.W. Leadbeater, who was one of the teachers and like mystics of the Theosophical Society in India, found him on a beach and saw his aura and was like, oh, I'm now convinced that this child is like actually the future Buddha. And so he went back to the Theosophical Society and they did a whole morass of rituals and astrology and all this other stuff, creating this very vast and elaborate magical conspiracy about how this kid is essentially the Buddha of the future. And they took him in and they started giving him training. And for those of you that don't know, the Theosophical Society is a society that was started by Madame Blavatsky. It was extremely important and historic. It was kind of the main vehicle through which knowledge of yoga and Eastern mysticism entered into the West. And I highly recommend reading a lot of the literature of the early Theosophical Society, because I think that it really contextualizes the process of like planetary evolution, human evolution, and collective enlightenment in a way that is a really powerful transmission from those masters. But at some point within his 20s, Krishnamurti then like rejected all of it, and not from the standpoint of like this isn't real, but rather he was just so fed up with the amount of kind of like astral and metaphysical like story that he was just wrapped up in, that he sort of broke parts from the Theosophical Society and centered his teaching very clearly on just simple Vedanta, just simple self-realization. And his life and that sort of process really kind of brings us back to a lesson that we were talking about earlier, which is just having right attitude about the practice and always coming back to the goal and being firmly rooted in the goal and not getting distracted. Because I think that this also illustrates one of the reasons why having a teacher is so important, because there are countless pitfalls along the path and countless ways of getting distracted. And as we engage and develop in our practices, as we start to cultivate these subtle senses and our sense of reality starts to expand, it's very easy to get lost and distracted by all this new phenomena, that we lose sight of the phenomena that all this phenomena is arising within, and that's our core consciousness, ourself. So Krishnamurti's life is definitely a testament to it. In his rejection of the Theosophical Society, he wasn't saying that this isn't real, he wasn't saying that this isn't valid, that he wasn't invalidating any of these things, but rather just saying like, this is all happening, but like don't get distracted. And for adepts, especially engaging in lots of magic, it's very easy to get distracted because there's just so much stuff, and it's also meaningful and powerful and beautiful and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like the path of yoga is the path from form to formlessness, right? And it's easy to get lost in its subtle form when we're just used to gross form, but it's about going beyond form altogether and transcending and including all of that, so that we learn how to live in like a wise and mutually beneficial way.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, there's also this kind of air to Theosophical Society that it was kind of colonizer, like there, and I think a lot of people have actually criticized the work of Blavatsky for being deeply kind of racist or kind of enabling certain types of like eugenic thinking. And, I don't know her, but like, I just think but they did, like, that's all that we've got coming from the West. Like, we don't know Sanskrit, and we don't, I wish I could, but I don't know, I don't speak Chinese. Like, there's so many places where these very old, pristine historical texts come from that like I just don't have access to. So I've had to use the Theosophical Society and the work that they've done. It's been extremely instrumental for me to try to get in touch with things that like I should be in touch with, but I've been uprooted from my culture in so many ways, you know, but and especially by being an American. So it's but and I think like there's this whole thing where they kind of took this kid who was extremely young and, you know, of course had so much potential, but it's almost like they made him into a star in a way that like he was obviously too wise to fall into the trap. You know, he was like, he probably saw what was happening to him and thought like, I don't want to be a figurehead. I don't want to continue the same, you know, paradigm and like abusive cycle that happens to in the guru disciple relationship, you know. And when I speak firsthand about what that is, like it's very much based on a certain amount of trauma and abuse, that is because suffering is something that is a very effective teacher, you know, and that's kind of why we are here on earth to suffer and learn. But it's kind of amazing how, you know, they put him on a stage and they're like, okay, now you're going to teach the world. And he was just like, look, I'm not a special person. Like, stop trying to listen to what I have to say, you know. But he kept speaking, thank God. And he was just like, you need to figure all this stuff out for yourself, basically. Like, I'm going to say this, but don't take my word for it, you know. And that was always kind of what he was always coming to in his speeches, which is really amazing. And yeah, there's also a lot of Chinese works that I've read at this point, translations at least, that stress this point of virtue. And in Taoist alchemy, they really don't say, I feel like in more of the Hindu work that I've read, they talk about siddhis, which are psychic abilities, supernatural powers, and, you know, just to kind of have a compendium of what might happen to you, to be able to give people road guideposts and you know, context for things that happen to them along the path. But in a lot of Chinese alchemy, they just don't talk about it. But there is so much folklore. There's so many stories about Taoist adepts and immortals and people who, you know, were able to transcend the three worlds or the five elements, and were able to do all these like mystical supernatural things like live forever and fly and levitate. And you still hear about this in like Kung Fu folklore, and martial arts and Chinese, I guess you would say Qigong culture, even though that's something that's been kind of eradicated, eliminated by the Chinese government. But they don't really focus on it in the manuals because it's something that really can't be, it can't be pursued. It's something that just comes as a byproduct. And you're only, and like what you're saying about responsibility really resonates, because there is so much that is actually in the hands of a higher power, whatever you want to call it. And it could just be the laws of nature, the universe, you know, like you're not actually, or it's just the law of karma and balance. You're not given the energy or the permission to see certain things, or to gain certain perception or you know, subtle perception or subtle information, unless you can be trusted with that information, unless you're practicing actively the ability to use it responsibility and the ability to know what is right and wrong about it, and to not get so excited about it that, you know, you're deciding that like, oh, I'm going to become a famous, you know, person who can do some supernatural thing now, like, because that's not actually necessarily going to help humanity. And you know, there has to be this vow taken, like you were saying, about to kind of create this trust with the spiritual world or with other dimensions, to hold yourself accountable with anything that, you know, these are gifts and they have to be used, you know, and valued for what they are. And it's the easiest way to like become extremely talented in an extreme amount of things, like, but you can't be doing it for that reason. You have to actually just want to be a good person, and that's like when all of this stuff kind of just comes as an added bonus.
Yeah, and I think that like I just kind of also want to add like a bit about the culture that like yoga and Vedanta kind of arose out of, where so something happened in the West where um, you had kind of like mythic traditional Christianity as like the dominant religion of the West. And then with the dawn of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, there was this kind of like split where religion was like wholesale rejected in favor of a rationalist, experimental, empirical worldview. Um, empirical worldview, right? And the West kind of has its narrative, its heroic narrative of itself, where it sees that, oh, like rationalism emerged in the West and it's the first place it ever emerged. And so like we are at the forefront of like whatever, right? It's kind of white supremacist mythology, right? But within India, within the Vedic culture, you had traditional mythic Hinduism, which was sort of like centered around the Puranas, centered around the various stories of the deities, and puja or like ritual, right? And ritual and myth go hand in hand across spiritual traditions throughout the world. And that's a much deeper conversation, especially as far as like ritual as symbolic language, the relationship between symbols and the unconscious, and all of that, how that ties into yoga. But it was out of this kind of mythic traditional Hinduism that then a distilled kind of like clear rationalist philosophy emerged, and that was Vedanta. And so Vedanta literally means Veda, and then Anta means end. So it's like the end of the Vedas. So Vedanta is really this kind of philosophical view that parallels existentialism in a lot of ways about the nature of the self and reality. And you had that sort of philosophical paradigm, but then there's a science that goes along with it, a science for validating these claims made by Vedanta. So according to Vedanta, you have the eye that sees, but the eye itself is not the seer. The mind sees the eye, right? But the mind itself is not the seer because something is seeing your mind. So that which is seeing both the eye and the mind is something separate from those things, but it's the space that these things arise out of, and that is the true self, right? But then how do you then go and test to see if this is true? How do you find it out for yourself, like Krishnamurti said? Right? Because Krishnamurti was constantly talking about how, don't just take my word for it, don't just take my word for it. The means whereby you test it is through engaging in the practices of yoga, such as concentration practice primarily. Concentration practice is the means whereby the mind becomes more and more single-pointed. And as it becomes single-pointed, then naturally the effort of trying to hold your mind on a single object of interior concentration, it stays more and more steady, and then that's naturally meditation. And then absorption into the object of meditation is what leads to self-realization. So it's through that practice that these ideas, this philosophy is then tested. But yoga kind of emerges out of this kind of scientific, sort of rationalist environment within India that happened way before it did in the West. The difference is in India, it didn't lead to a break with religion altogether, but just another form of spiritual engagement. And so that's why a lot of us here, it's like we start to gravitate towards yoga and meditation after a period of rejecting our traditional faith and rejecting our traditional religion, because our minds are already tuned to want to test things out for ourselves. It's already tuned to want to have a clear sort of understanding of the world that's not mired in dogma and all of these other things. So in that way, yoga is kind of perfect for our particular climate and our particular sort of mindsets that are less prone to just swallowing bullshit just because somebody in authority told us to believe it.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, it's beautiful because I really, the more I've learned about these topics, I've been so just excited by how actually scientific it is. And when it comes to you have to test these things for yourself and you have to practice for yourself, that's a place where you can actually get reproducible results. And that's one of the big things about in the scientific era, or the Enlightenment era in the West, was the key in what they considered empirical science. Like, you have to be able to reproduce those results, and you really can. And you don't have to be a part of an institution. You can actually try these things. I think one of the hardest things, though, for people in the West is to kind of separate, like, I think when we see things like puja and the ways that, like, ritual is still really prevalent in the East, so we see it as kind of superstitious and primitive, you know, and I mean, it's really, I really think that stems from a deeply seated racism, but and just like a xenophobia, like not willingness to kind of experience everything deeper, but also just the inability to maintain a discipline. I think our culture makes it so hard to commit to anything and to really just practice, like really stick to something, really do it 20 minutes a day, twice a day. Like, it really changed my life. And this is something that, you know, martial artists are constantly saying to people too, like, just, you have to have discipline, you have to really practice. And it's so simple, but it's really it's really hard, but it's also important to, and I think people get caught up in, like, you know, wanting to start a practice and then falling off a little bit and then beating themselves up over it. But the only thing that's important is that you get back on the horse. When you're meditating, you might fall asleep, you might go into some crazy, you know, illusion or dream, some kind of like reverie that's not, you know, actually in a high meditative state. And it's like you can either go into another tangent of being disappointed in yourself about it, or you can just come back to the center. And yeah, meditation is like a microcosm of it, just where everything kind of collapses into itself, of like the way that you actually can be taking little steps here and there, anywhere, to improve your life and just bring your awareness and your full self to everything that you do.
Yeah, I just sort of like add to that like the practice of concentration, or dharana, which is the basis from which dhyana and then later samadhi emerge, is this process of basically holding your awareness on something, getting distracted, bringing it back,
Mm-hmm.
getting distracted, bringing it back, getting distracted, bringing it back, over and over and over again, until the distractions just stop coming about and you stop moving, right? Now, that basic metaphor also applies. That's basically all discipline is. All discipline is trying to do something, falling off, getting back on it, falling off, getting back on it, falling off, getting back on it, until you just stop falling off. So it's like just that process of training the mind through concentration teaches you so much about everyday life.
Yeah.
It teaches you so much about the virtue of repetition, doing things over and over and over again. And that it's like the fact that the results of yoga are so reproducible is what makes it accessible truly, because it takes the concept of enlightenment, of spiritual realization, off of this pedestal of something that's only accessible to certain special people as a result of a special birth, to something that any human being can experience for themselves. And it's actually the birthright of any human being. The only cost that you have to pay is twofold. One, it's the commitment to practice, and two, sacrificing your ego at the end. And that's ultimately what it's all about, because it's like the difference between yoga and like magic informed by yoga, which some might call tantra, is essentially like the abnegation of the ego and being engaged in a process where you're continuously abnegating your ego to experience the true self.
Yeah. And I think the last thing we haven't really mentioned is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is in the resources there. And I just added that because that is one, it's considered kind of an extreme form of yoga, but what's really cool is in there is that it can, like when you're saying about the steps of crude awareness or gross awareness, to the subtle, to the causal, to the non-dual, it's something that Hatha Yoga is basically a system that's defined by its preparation for meditation. So it considers meditation as a step that you can't really actually get to until you sort of get certain things right in your body on the gross level. So these are kind of fast track exercises to purify the physical medium that your consciousness then, goes through, and prepare you for higher knowledge and prepare you for higher education, because that is, I think, something that really rings true for me. And when it comes to my physical health and my diet and things like that, the more that I've actually been able to do the disciplines that keep those things in balance, the more I've been able to actually process higher information and receive, just messages from other dimensions, and better cognition, better understanding of everything around me. So that book is there, and yeah, it's a big one, but it's interesting if you want to kind of know more about yoga philosophy, just in addition to Yoga Sutras also. And we wanted to say one more thing about, I don't know, I guess what's important is, I think there's a lot of spiritual practice that does focus so much on samadhi and so much on meditation, and even overly focusing on this like moral high ground, that it starts to neglect the more physical parts of being human. And I think, especially in the context of what our aims are as a collective, is really important, especially like in an environment where there's so much activism that is required from us at this time. It's important to find ways not to burn out, and to really learn how to conserve our energy, take care of our bodies, and still be spiritual, and still unite the physical and non-physical actualization. And yeah, it's so useful to have these contexts and these philosophies that lay out for us like what a healthy body really looks like, and not excluding the psychic realm from that picture of health.
Thank you both so much. I just got so full of all the most and best information, and really appreciate it. I feel like I've never heard anyone talk about yoga and meditation like that, so I love it. It felt like all of the information ever concise in a way that I could understand, and that's freaking amazing, because I get distracted when people talk about yoga and meditation all the time. It like makes me want to like run away or freak out, because it's so intense. And I think that is because like the people that are talking about it right now, and what you do in your own personal life, and how you're expressing yourself into the world. And I think that's what's so important about like restoring our places in the front of the classroom, right? Because it's important where we get this information from. You brought up like the class that Julian and I were hosting about healing communication, and I really never read that book either, because it was so terrible, and it was just so like, it's just like this white dude who was like telling me how to communicate, and I'm just like, no, I've already heard a lot of that, so no. But then when Julian explains it, I saw it differently, so I feel that carries through with a lot of things, And I also wanted to touch on like the idea of not just being in the astral world and getting stuck out there or getting distracted. And Krishnamurti also coming back to that place of like being grounded in what he wanted to do in this world. And I attribute that to Shiva Shakti, the dance of those experiences. So I really honor Shiva Shakti in the way that they both teach me, that at sometimes I am spending like days or months or whatever, years, whatever it may be, to like connect to my spiritual self, to hone in on my psychic abilities, to revel in them, even to get a little ego and excited, because it's nice when you can see the magic in the world again, especially if you've been colonized or traumatized, or you just had a difficult life and you want to restore that sense of joy and spirituality. The magic is what they give us, I think, to like say like, oh, come back, it's okay, or here's something to like live for right now. And then the practice deepens, and then you do like the deeper work, and you look at all this stuff, and you know that exists, and then you can share that with other people that are trying to restore their faith. I think that it's a story of surrender, because we often get jaded through our years of growing and experiencing this world, and we forget that we're Atman, that we're soul, and then we have to restore that connection. And I think those little tricks and sparks are nice for that. But I also agree with like grounding the practice, and that does look like showing up in the world in service, you know. And I see how people that are not even talking about their spirituality or using certain practices or the language that we use are doing really great things in the world. And it's kind of that is what helps me ground, to remember that. And I feel lately that I'm called a lot of times to do like really what I would have considered like mundane work. Like I thought I was going to spiral into like this, like, you know, I was just going to walk around in robes all the time with like, you know, like glitter on my face and a crystal crown. And I still could. Nothing's wrong with that. So if you want to do it, just do it. Be your best self. But that there's something else that I'm meant to like work on inside my own life that's going to bring service to the world. And that's where that power was needed. It's like I needed to power up. And I think that that's happening to a lot of us. Like, so if you have moments where you don't feel like you're in touch with spirit anymore, no matter how many years you've been doing your practice, you are just in that part of Shakti where she's in the world doing the dance. And Shiva is when you're sitting there and you're absorbing and you're witnessing. You're not doing, you're not acting, you're passive, you know. And I really think that that's the important part of yoga too, is the active, passive dance. So, you know, we're sometimes passive and receiving and acknowledging and witnessing without judging ourselves, first of all, and then the world, and then the active part of Shakti, dancing into it and learning how to harmonize our dances with others. And that's where the messy stuff gets in there. But the practice gives you like the support to go through it, you know, calming the mind, getting centered, you know, getting in touch with your body and finding out how it's going to be triggered and hurt while you go into the dance. You know, like if you know that you have this particular ailment, you're going to be not signing up for like, you know, the marathon dance for like 24 hours. You know what you can do, and you'll learn to accept yourself while you do it. And also wanted to touch on the theosophy thing, that the Theosophical Society spaces that I have heard of and the ones that I've seen are predominantly white. They host a lot of really like, you know, colonized thinking type workshops, and it's irritating. I do like value like Blavatsky in the sense that like during some of my like psychedelic days, she did come to me, and I feel like there is something really special that she had to offer. But I am really frustrated, especially as a person who is like West Indian with South Asian heritage, that I should have to learn from white people stuff that I feel like I can just tune into if I just tune in hard enough, if I just return to even a few simple practices. And I think when it comes to like yoga and meditation, there are so many forms of it. I agree with that too. And I really wanted to reaffirm that there are so many forms of it. Like, and the ones that were mentioned are not even the only ones. And that there are so many practices like pre-Hindu, pre-Buddhist that are tantric, but they're not called tantra, right? They're part of like, you know, Dravidian heritage, for instance, or they're part of like, you know, pre-structured Tamil heritage of like, you know, Kali worship, like Mariamman, the folk goddesses, you know, and that exists all over the world, you know. So there are a lot of powerful primordial forces that teach us how to move our bodies, because dance came up in that as well, to move our bodies and to breathe, you know. And sometimes movement just activates you to breathe. You don't have to sit and breathe. Sometimes you just are forced into those deep breaths when you're in movement. And also adding tantric painting or meditational painting as one of the acts of yoga. And it's really special because families literally taught it to each other. So it was something that you learned through your family. And colonialism, of course, like struck that right through the middle right there and disconnected a lot of us from those practices. But what happens is that you're channeling all of your energy as you would in meditation, but it's into your hand and then into like a brush or like whatever you're using to paint, into these very simple shapes, like the most simple shapes. And I remember growing up and looking at like, you know, paintings and stuff in like fancy museums of like just a square or like a triangle, and being like, I don't fucking get this. This is so annoying. And I think the part that was lacking was like that culture of tradition from that kind of like minimalist experience, because when you can channel all that energy through your body from focus and concentration, meditation, yoga, and then create something from it, it can be so simple and so powerful. And I also encourage everybody to keep supporting like POC in the classrooms and in the workshops, like whether it's with TGT or wherever, because that is part of the service as well. And I feel really strongly called to that service right now, like to support it, to be a part of it. And there's just like less and less silence happening in terms of my practice right now. So I'm definitely in my Shakti, and I'll be returning to my Shiva, of course, but I just wanted to add all those things and just like support y'all in your journey. And thank you for everyone that came. And I think we can like close out the recording and do a little shares for maybe 15 minutes or so, if everyone's okay with that.
Well, I think Julian had one more thing to say, if you still want to.
Well, how are we on time?
Well, I mean, you have time to share if you want to, definitely, before the recording stops so we can get in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess like one more thing that Lalit and I were talking about was about, and I guess this like ties into what we're talking about with like Hatha yoga, and also with virtue and the cultivation of sort of like character development through yoga. And it's really something I've been thinking a lot about in light of like abolition, right? So abolition, for those that aren't like familiar, is a word that has been used since slavery in the Western world. And it's a movement for the abolition of slavery, but also in the 21st century takes the form of abolition of the prison industrial complex, and also abolition of the effects of slavery over time. Within the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, they talk about, how one goes about sort of like reforming a person, right, who has done something wrong or some kind of crime. And contrary to the kind of narrative of the West, the punitive kind of logic, or the logic of sort of like discipline and punishment, Hatha Yoga kind of views it from a different angle, where they see it as, first and foremost, if someone, say for example, they've been engaged in organized crime and they've like harmed people and they're in jail, what have you. First and foremost, the priority is to purify the body, because we have this notion that this human is like inherent, it's like in a fixed sense, not like changeable, or not like can't be transformed, can't be rehabilitated. Whereas from a Hatha Yoga perspective, you can change the biochemistry using Hatha Yoga and Ayurveda. So there's actually, that as actually first and foremost. And this also has a lot to do with like physical needs, and how a lot of things come from a place of poverty, which comes from a place of like lack of access to your core physical needs. So it's like, first and foremost, meet people's physical needs, and then work on purification of the body on like a biochemical level, which Hatha Yoga is a science around. And then from there, you can start to purify the mind and start to integrate ethical frameworks of like conduct and like all of these other things. So there is a very sort of small movement emerging around like meditation in prisons, and it's not really connected to a larger framework around prison abolition. And it's not necessarily connected to this larger framework of yoga as an entire system versus yoga as a singular practice. But I think that there's like a lot of potential around using this as an alternative to the kind of like punitive systems of punishment that we're kind of used to. And I very much think about the larger project of enlightenment, of abolition, abolition not only of slavery, but of the effects of slavery in light of the context of like sort of planetary enlightenment, the enlightenment of the African diaspora, and that also being synonymous with like the liberation of the planet and like the liberation of the African diaspora. So I remember that when I was taking my Bodhisattva vows, and we would reiterate them every single time we went to the monastery. Every single weekend when we go for group meditation, you have to chant your Bodhisattva vows. And it would always end with, may all beings be free. right? And they mean that on a deep spiritual level. And I think of that in an integrated level, politically, spiritually, psychologically, etc. May all beings be free. That is the core intention. And that is kind of what we're working towards. And the cultivation of that energy is bodhicitta. So I think that bringing that energy of bodhicitta to our like mundane, everyday, engaged activism and interpersonal relationships and culture and all these other things, I think is incredibly important, because we live in a world where everything is evolving. We're evolving politically, we're evolving technologically, scientifically, spiritually, in terms of our awareness of our mental health, emotionally, creatively. And so I think that, you know, you have monks whose 9-to-5 job is just to meditate and to refine the science so that it can be given to others. But I think that we also have householders, and that's who all we are. And our job is to go within, cultivate this light of awareness and bring it to the world in whatever it is we have to do. So with that, thank you all.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Nandini as well. Don't forget to make your suggested donation of $7.77 to Kali Ma on Venmo. If you are able to do such a thing, it really helps our community and you know, helps us continue to provide all of these free services. And yeah, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, and let's keep talking in private.